Hey everyone, Teacher Chang here today, and we're going to talk about parallel and perpendicular lines. And our goal is to determine the equation of a line that is parallel or perpendicular to another line. So what we are going to do is we're going to talk about parallel lines first. And the first thing that we notice about parallel lines is that the slopes must be the same. So here we got two examples of two lines here. And the first line that we have here is going to give us a slope of -5/6. And then our second one has a slope of -5/6 as well. And therefore, both of these lines must be parallel. Now, we typically write our equations in slope-intercept form, which is this y is equal to mx plus b. And other times we may want to write it in point-slope form, which is y minus y1 is equal to m times x minus x1, where x1 and y1 is a point on the line. For our sake, we're going to do everything in slope-intercept form. In terms of perpendicular lines, the slopes are obviously different. The slopes are going to be negative reciprocals. Some people might call it opposite reciprocals. So in other words, if we take a look at the slopes here, our first one has a slope of -1/5. That's the one in red here. And if you go ahead and take the reciprocal, meaning that you flip that fraction, that's going to give us 5/1, but we want the opposite. So instead of a negative, well, that's going to become a positive. Another thing that we can notice here is that if we multiply the two slopes that are perpendicular, so if we multiply the 5/1 and the -1/5, well, that's always going to equal to -1. So the product of the slopes that of lines that are perpendicular will always equal to -1. All right, so let's go ahead and put some of these into action here. We want to write out an equation in slope-intercept form for a line that is perpendicular to this line, y is equal to 2/3 x plus 5, and yet at the same time, it needs to pass through the point 3, 2. Okay, so since we know that this line is going to be perpendicular, we know that we're dealing with a negative reciprocal. And therefore, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the slope that we have in this particular line, which is 2/3. And we're just going to go ahead and take the reciprocal, which is 3/2. And we're going to do the opposite, which means we're going to make it a negative. So one has to be positive. Well, that means this one has to be negative. We also know that in this particular case that it has to go through the point 3, 2, which is an x and a y. And since we want to write out our equation in slope-intercept form, that's y equals mx plus b. So I'm just going to substitute what I know here. So I do know that my y value is 2. I know my x value is 3. I know my slope is -3/2. And I'm just going to fill everything else in with that equal sign and that plus b. That b is my y-intercept, which I don't know yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the math here, and I'm just going to go ahead and multiply -3/2 times 3, and that's just going to give me -9/2. I'll bring down the plus b, the equal sign, and the 2. So now we just want to go ahead and solve for b. We're going to add 9/2 on both sides. And to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and change this 2 so that it says 4/2. I just want to make sure that we have common denominators, and that way when I add, these 9/2s will cancel out, and I'm just going to write the b on the left. So b is equal to, well, 4 plus 9 is 13. So b is equal to 13/2. So now that I have this b, which is my y-intercept, I have my slope. I'm going to take both of these and write out my equation. Y is equal to -3/2x plus 13/2. Now you can leave it like this, or because since the denominators are the same, you can also write your answer so it looks like this. Y is equal to -3x plus 13, and all of that is over 2. And that's only because they have the same denominator. So let's go ahead and try another one, except this time we have a line that is parallel to y is equal to x plus 4, and it also has to go through the point 2, 2. Now, if that's the case here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look for that slope again, and that slope, because it's parallel, that means that the slope must be the same, so the same slope. Well, the slope of this line is 1, so I know that my slope is going to be 1 here. So what I want to do now is, again, pretty much the same thing I did before. I'm going to take a look at my point, which is at 2, 2. That's an x and a y. And I'm going to substitute my x, my y, and my slope into my slope formula, or my slope-intercept form. So y is equal to mx plus b. Again, I'll just substitute my y as 2. My x is also 2. My slope happens to be 1. And I'll just bring down the equal sign and the plus b. So if I solve this, we now have 2 is equal to 2 plus b. And, well, that's nice and simple because all we do is subtract 2 on both sides. And, well, we're left with b is equal to 0. So like before, I'm going to take my b, I'm going to take my m, and I'm just going to go ahead and write out my slope-intercept form. Y is equal to, well, my slope is 1, x plus b, which is 0. And, well, we typically rewrite that as just y is equal to x. So that's the equation of that line. That is parallel to x plus 4 and goes through the point 2, 2. All right. Try one more. It says we want a line that is parallel to y is equal to 1/8 x plus 2. And it has to go through the point 1, negative 5. So once again, because it's parallel, we want to have the same slope. So the slope in this case is 1/8. So I'm going to keep that slope 1/8 because it's parallel. And we know that it has to go through the point 1, negative 5. And that's my x and my y value. So once again, I'm just going to substitute everything into my slope-intercept form. Y is equal to mx plus b. And y, in this case, is negative 5. X is 1. And my slope is 1/8. I'll bring everything else down. I'll bring down the equal sign and the plus b. So now I have negative 5 is equal to 1/8 plus b. And we want to get b by itself, so once again, I'm going to subtract 1/8 on both sides. Now I'm going to convert that negative 5 as negative 40/8, because negative 40 divided by 8 is still negative 5. And we're just going to go ahead and solve for b here. So these 1/8 will cancel out. I'm just going to write the b on the left. And negative 40/8 minus 1/8 is just negative 41/8. So here's my y-intercept. So once again, I'll take my y-intercept, I'll take my slope, and I'll write out my equation. Y is equal to 1/8 x minus 41/8. So this is one way to write it. Or, once again, you can go ahead and see that we have a common denominator. So we could just write it as y is equal to x minus 41, and all of that is over 8. So 2 ways that you can write that out. All right, this next problem is a little bit different here. It says that we want to write out an equation of a line in slope-intercept form that passes through the point 0, negative 1, and is also parallel with another line determined by the points negative 3, negative 2, and 2, 4. So that negative 3, negative 2, and that 2, 4 is going to create one line, and my second line must be parallel to that line. And yet at the same time, again, it has to go through the point 0, negative 1. So the first thing that I notice, again, it says parallel. So I want the same slope. So I need to figure out, well, what is the slope of this first line? And that first line is going to be based off of my 2 points here, x, y, x, and y. And, well, I'm just going to call this first one my first point, and this is my second point, so x2 and y2. And the formula to calculate the slope of this line is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So I'm just going to plug and play here. So I have my fraction bar, I have my minus sign in the numerator and the denominator, and I'm just going to substitute here. So my y2 is 4 minus y1, which is negative 2, so that means plus 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and do my x's here. So my x2 is 2. Minus x1, which is negative 3, so that means plus 3. And if I go ahead and solve that, that means my slope, m, is going to be 6/5. So here's my slope. So now that I have my slope, I'm going to use this information and figure out, well, what is the equation of my second line that goes through the point 0, -1. So 0 is my x value, -1 is my y value. And once again, I'm just going to substitute that information into my slope-intercept form. Y is equal to mx plus b. So I know that my y value is -1, my x value is 0, and my slope is 6/5. Now, this is nice because that x is equal to 0. And, well, anything times 0 is just 0, so that means b has to equal to -1. Okay, so I'm going to take that b value, I'm going to take that m value, and I'm going to write out my equation. Y is equal to 6/5x minus 1. All right, so let's go ahead and try one more. And again, this one is slightly different here. Pretty much the same thing as the last one, but this is a little bit different because this time they're looking at a perpendicular bisector. So here we know it's perpendicular, and perpendicular means that the slopes is going to be a negative reciprocal. Okay, and we know that we have a bisector. Well, what does the word bisector mean? Well, bisect means to cut in half. So if we cut the line in half, that means this is going to end up being a midpoint. So we want to figure out, okay, well, what is that midpoint here? Because it has to go through that midpoint. And the first line is at 1, 3. It goes through the points 1, 3, and 5, 9. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and figure out what is that midpoint. So that midpoint is going to be using the formula m is equal to the average of our x's. Average of the x's. So that means x1 plus x2 over 2. And the average of our y's, y1 plus y2 over 2. So I want to figure out, okay, well, what is the midpoint of my line here? So I'm going to go ahead and calculate that midpoint by using these two values. So here's my x1, my y1, my x2, and my y2. And I'm just going to go ahead and substitute everything in. So my x's are 1 and 5, so that means 1 plus 5, and we're going to divide that by 2. And my y's are going to be my 3 and my 9. So that means I'm going to do 3 plus 9 and divide that by 2. And this is going to give me that ordered pair. So I'm going to go ahead and add those together. 1 plus 5 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 plus 9 is 12. 12 divided by 2 is 6. So we know that it has to go through this point at 3, 6. We also need to figure out, well, what is the slope of our line? And we know that the slope of our line follows the formula y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And we're going to use those same 2 points. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my fraction bar and the minus signs in the numerator and the denominator. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. My y2 is 9 minus y1, which is 3, over x2, which is 5, minus x1, which is 1. So if we calculate this, we know that the slope is going to end up being 6/4, which we could simplify to 3/2. Now remember, we stated earlier that the slope, because it's perpendicular, must be a negative reciprocal. So that means the slope of our new line, so because it's a negative reciprocal, the slope of our new line is going to be -2/3. We got to flip that 3/2 and make it its opposite. Okay, so now that I have this information, I'm going to use my slope that we just found, and we're going to use that point that it has to go through, which is this one over here, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing that we did earlier. We're going to come up with that equation by doing y is equal to mx plus b and substitute what we know. Well, again, here's my x and my y value. The y value is 6. The x value is 3. The slope in this case is going to be -2/3. And we'll just bring down the equal sign, the plus sign, and that b. So we want to go ahead and solve for b here. I'm just going to slide this up a bit. Okay, now in order to do this, we got to multiply negative 2/3 times 3, which is just going to cancel out the 3. So now we got 6 is equal to negative 2 plus b. And then we just add 2 on both sides. So b is equal to 8. Well, now that I know what b is, and I have my slope, I'm going to bring those two together, and that's going to give me y is equal to negative 2/3 x plus 8. So that's the equation of our line. That is a perpendicular bisector, and it goes through the line 1, 3, and 5, 9. All right, I hope that helped out. Leave a comment, subscribe, and give me a thumbs up. All right, have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.